June 4, 1942. Dawn, 240 miles northwest of Midway Atoll, for 30 hours. The flight deck of USS Enterprise trembled beneath the boots of sailors who had not slept. Salt spray stung faces, already raw from days of wind and sun, in the pre-dawn darkness. Mechanics worked by shielded flashlights, hands moving with practiced urgency across radial engines that would soon carry men into a battle. None fully understood. The smell aviation fuel, hot metal, sweat-soaked canvas hung thick in the humid air. Somewhere beyond the horizon, hidden by night and the curve of the Pacific, an enemy fleet steamed toward Midway with the weight of an empire behind it. For carriers, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of men who believed, with the certainty of faith, that victory was preordained by destiny and superior spirit. Lieutenant Commander Wade McClusky stood in the dimness of the ready room, studying reconnaissance. Photographs that revealed nothing and everything, empty ocean, cloud banks. The Japanese were out there. Had to be. Intelligence said so. Radio intercepts confirmed it. But the Pacific was vast, and finding a fleet in that immensity was like finding intent in silence. His pilots, young men, most of them, with faces still soft from youth, waited for orders that would send them into the sky, with fuel enough for one chance, one attack, one hope of finding an enemy that outnumbered them in every measurable way. What followed in the hours ahead would be dissected, analyzed, dramatized, and misunderstood for decades. The Battle of Midway would enter history as a turning point. The moment American carrier aviation broke the back of Japanese naval power in a single morning. But the story told in the years after the neat narrative of planning and execution, of intelligence, advantages, and tactical brilliance would obscure a messier truth. That victory hung on improvisation, on mistakes corrected in mid-flight, on decisions made with incomplete information by exhausted men who had no choice but to commit everything to attacks that should have failed. And at the center of that chaos, one carrier group Enterprise would fly a mission so desperate, so improbable, that its success would seem, in retrospect, less like strategy and more like survival elevated to the level of art. The war in the Pacific, by June 1942, had been a catalog of disasters for the United States. Pearl Harbor had shattered the battleship navy. The Philippines had fallen. Wake Island, Guam, the Dutch East Indies all conquered in a Japanese offensive that moved with the speed and precision of a machine designed for exactly this purpose. American forces retreated, regrouped, and retreated again, buying time with blood while the industrial might of the nation struggled to mobilize. The Japanese combined fleet dominated the Pacific. Its carrier strike forced the Quito Butte undefeated and seemingly invincible. 6 months of war had taught painful lessons. American torpedoes failed more often than they succeeded. Torpedo. Bombers slow. Vulnerable Douglas TBD devastators flew into combat knowing they were obsolete. Fighter cover was inconsistent. Doctrine, built around peacetime assumptions, collapsed under the violence of actual combat. Carrier task forces operated in a fog of uncertainty, with radio silence and vast distances making coordination a matter of hope as much as planning. But the United States held one advantage the Japanese could not match: intelligence. Codebreakers at Station Hypo in Hawaii had cracked enough of the Japanese naval code to predict, with reasonable certainty, that Admiral Yamamoto planned a major offensive against Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand that served as the westernmost American outpost in the Central Pacific. The objective was not just the atoll, but the American carriers that would surely come to defend it. Yamamoto intended to finish what Pearl Harbor had started, to lure the remaining U.S. carriers into battle and destroy them, securing Japanese dominance for years to come. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, took the intelligence and made a calculated gamble. He would ambush the ambushers, 3 American carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown would position themselves northeast of Midway in wait. When the Japanese struck the atoll, American carriers would strike back, catching the enemy at their most vulnerable, aircraft rearming and refueling on deck. Bombs and torpedoes scattered, fighters low on fuel from combat air patrol. The plan was sound. The execution would be anything but. The Japanese expected resistance. They planned for it. But what they expected was token defensive Marine fighters, some anti-aircraft fire, perhaps a sortie or two from the American carriers if those ships could even be found in time. Japanese naval aviation was the finest in the world. Its pilots were veterans of China, Pearl Harbor, the East Indies, and Ceylon. They flew superior aircraft, the Mitsubishi A6M0, fast and agile, flown by men who had been training since before the war began. American pilots, by contrast, were green. Many had never seen combat. Their aircraft F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntless, dive bombers, TBD Devastator torpedo bombers were considered adequate, but not exceptional on paper. The Japanese advantage was overwhelming. For carriers to 3, more aircraft, more experience, better fighters. The Kido Butai had never lost a carrier battle. There was no reason to believe this one would be different, but numbers obscured fragility. Japanese carriers, designed for offensive power, carried enormous striking power, but lacked the damage control systems and armored flight decks of their British counterparts. American carriers, by contrast, had been built with lessons learned from British experience in the Atlantic. Damage control parties trained relentlessly. Firefighting systems were robust. Armored fuel lines reduced the risk of catastrophic fires. These differences seemed minor, even irrelevant, before the battle. They would prove decisive during it. The morning of June 4th began with confusion. American patrol aircraft spotted elements of the Japanese fleet, but initial reports were fragmentary and contradictory. Positions were uncertain. Courses speculative. Carrier commanders had to decide, launch now with partial information, or wait for confirmation and risk missing the window of opportunity entirely. Delay meant the Japanese would strike Midway, recover their aircraft, and be ready for whatever the Americans could throw at them. Speed meant sending pilots into the sky with only the vaguest notion of where the enemy actually was. They launched. The strike from Enterprise, led by McClusky, consisted of dive bombers and a small fighter escort, the torpedo bombers Devastators. From Torpedo Squadron 6 had launched earlier, flying low and slow toward a projected intercept point. Coordination between the dive bombers and torpedo bombers was supposed to ensure simultaneous attacks from multiple angles, overwhelming Japanese defenses, but in the chaos of launch, communication, and navigation, that coordination fell apart. The squadrons flew on different headings at different altitudes, losing contact with each other and with the enemy. McClusky's dive bombers reached the projected intercept point and found nothing. Empty ocean stretched in every direction. Fuel gauges dropped. The temptation to turn back, to preserve aircraft and pilots for another day, must have been overwhelming. But McClusky made a decision that would define the battle. He kept searching. Extending the search meant burning fuel needed for the return journey. It meant that even if they found the enemy, some aircraft might not make it back. But turning back meant failure. And failure meant the Japanese would be free to strike Midway and then hunt down the American carriers at their leisure. So he searched, and the minutes dragged on, each one burning fuel, narrowing options, increasing the likelihood that this mission would end in ditching at sea or running out of fuel. Inside of the carrier, with no way to land, then, below and to the north, a white wake carved across the blue Pacific, a Japanese destroyer racing at full speed. Ships moved fast for only 2 reasons, pursuit or retreat. McClusky gambled it was heading back to the main fleet. He followed the wake and found for Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft, being refueled in our EARMED. What happened next has been replayed in documentaries, films, and history so many times that it has taken on the quality of myth. But the reality was more chaotic and far more desperate than the sanitized versions suggest. McClusky's dive bombers were alone. The torpedo bombers that were supposed to attack simultaneously were gone. Most shot down in a suicidal low-altitude assault that achieved nothing, but drew Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving the sky above momentarily undefended. The fighter escort had turned back, low on fuel. The dive bombers had no cover, no support, and fuel enough for one attack and a prayer of making it home. McClusky split his formation. Half would attack the carrier Kaga, half would hit Akagi, the flagship. There was no time for elaborate tactics, no opportunity for coordinated runs. Just one chance, dive, drop, and hope. The dive bombers rolled into their attacks. Gravity pulled them down through thin air into the thickening atmosphere where anti-aircraft fire began to claw upward. Black bursts of flak bracketed the aircraft. Tracers stitched glowing lines across the sky. The Japanese carriers, caught in the middle of rearming operations, erupted into frantic action, but it was too late. Bombs fell, some missed, throwing up geysers of white water alongside the carriers, but others hit. A 1,000-pound bomb penetrated Akagi's flight deck and detonated in the hangar, where fueled and armed aircraft waited for launch. The explosion touched off secondary blast fuel, bombs, torpedoes that ripped through the ship's interior. Fire spread faster than damage. Control parties could contain them. Within minutes, Akagi was doomed, her flight deck a blazing ruin, her hangar a crematorium. Kaga suffered the same fate. Multiple bomb hits ignited fires that consumed the ship from within. A third carrier, Soryu, was hit by dive bombers from Yorktown in a simultaneous attack that, by sheer chance, coincided with Enterprise's assault. 3 Japanese carriers, veteran ships of the WWII, survivors of Pearl Harbor, and every campaign since transformed into floating pyres in the span of 5 minutes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, survived long enough to launch a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown. But later that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found Hiryu and delivered the same fate. Bombs through the flight deck, fires in the hangar, the ship abandoned and scuttled. For carriers, the entire strike force that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months, gone in a single day. The pilots who survived the attack faced a different battle, getting home. Fuel gauges hovered near empty. Some aircraft ran dry and ditched in the ocean. Crews picked up by destroyers hours later. Others made it back to the carrier on fumes. Landing with engines sputtering, tanks showing zero, McClusky himself landed, with just enough fuel to taxi clear of the arresting wire dot in the ready rooms. Exhaustion and relief collided. Men who had flown into combat expecting to die sat in silence, processing survival. The intelligence officers who debriefed them struggled to piece together a coherent picture. From fragmented accounts, pilots reported hits, fires, carriers burning. But the scale of the victory, the sheer magnitude of what had just happened took hours to confirm. The Japanese, meanwhile, faced catastrophe. For carriers lost meant not just ships, but aircraft, pilots, and the mechanics and support personnel who made naval aviation function. Worse, it shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the WWII. Japanese strategic planning had assumed carrier superiority. Offensive operations across the Pacific depended on it. With that superiority gone, the entire calculus of the war shifted. Japan would never again operate with the freedom it had enjoyed in the war's first 6 months. Every subsequent campaign would be defensive, reactive, a slow grinding retreat across the Pacific toward the home islands. For the United States, Midway was proof that the war could be won. Not easily, not quickly, but it could be won. The industrial base that had seemed so irrelevant in the war's early disasters now had time to matter. Shipyards began producing carriers at a rate Japan could not match. Training programs churned out pilots faster than combat could consume them. The advantage in resources dormant at war's start began to manifest in ways that compounded over time. But the popular memory of Midway, shaped by films and documentaries, often reduced the battle to a story of intelligence and planning codebreakers, predicting the attack, Nimitz setting the ambush, American dive bombers striking at the perfect moment. The narrative, while true, elided the chaos, the improvisation, and the sheer desperation that defined the actual experience. McClusky's decision to keep searching when his fuel was running low was not part of a plan. It was a gamble born of necessity. The torpedo bomber attacks that preceded the dive bombing were not coordinated brilliance. They were uncoordinated sacrifices that happened to pull Japanese fighters out of position. The simultaneous attacks on multiple carriers were not synchronized strategy. They were coincidence and luck. This messiness, this improvisation in the face of uncertainty was not a flaw in the American performance. It was the essence of it, the ability to adapt when plans fell apart, to make decisions with incomplete information, to trust junior officers to exercise judgment rather than await orders. These were advantages that did not appear in any order of battle, but proved decisive nonetheless. Japanese doctrine prized precision and coordination. When those broke down, as they inevitably did in combat, the system struggled to adapt. American forces, by contrast, seemed almost built for chaos. Plans were provisional. Doctrine was flexible. Initiative was encouraged. When things went wrong, and they always went wrong, American forces adjusted and kept fighting. McClusky's search for the Japanese fleet exemplified this. He was not following orders when he extended his search. He was exercising judgment, weighing risk against opportunity, and committing to a course of action that could easily have ended in disaster. That it ended in victory instead was due partly to skill, partly to luck, and partly to the willingness of the system to trust him to make that call. The film that would eventually tell this story, released decades after the battle, titled simply Midway, struggled with the same challenge every historical dramatization faces: how to balance accuracy with narrative coherence. The 1976 version, star-studded and sweeping, captured the scale but sanitized the chaos. The 2019 version, more technically accurate and visually spectacular, came closer to depicting the desperation and confusion, but still imposed a narrative structure that made the battle feel more comprehensible than it actually was. Neither film fully conveyed what it felt like to be in a dive bomber, fuel gauge dropping, no enemy in sight, every instinct screaming to turn back, and then the decision to keep searching. Neither captured the terror of diving through flak with no fighter cover, knowing that if you missed, you were out of fuel and out of options. Neither conveyed the silence in the ready room afterward, when men realized they had just participated in something that would alter the course of the war, and they had done it not through heroism in the dramatic sense, but through sheer stubborn refusal to quit. Film as a medium struggled with this. It needed heroes and villains, rising action and climax, clear cause and effect. But battles rarely followed that structure. They were chaotic, confusing, and often determined by decisions made in seconds with information that was incomplete or wrong. The men who fought them were not heroes in the cinematic sense, square-jawed and fearless. They were tired, scared, and often just trying to survive. That they succeeded was not inevitable. It was improbable, and that improbability made the victory more, not less, remarkable. The symbolic object that defined Midway, if one had to be chosen, was not a weapon or a piece of equipment, but something more abstract. Fuel. Every decision in the battle revolved around fuel. How much fuel to launch with, how far to search, whether to extend the search or turn back, whether to attack immediately or wait for better positioning. Fuel was time, and time was opportunity. The Japanese carriers burned because American dive bombers found them at the moment they were most vulnerable, but finding them required burning fuel that pilots might need to get home. The gamble was existential. Spend the fuel searching, and you might die even if you find them. Don't spend it, and the enemy escapes to kill you another day. Fuel, in this sense, became a metaphor for commitment. Half measures failed. Holding back reserves meant defeat. The only way to win was to commit everything, knowing there might not be enough left to survive the aftermath. McClusky committed. His pilots committed. Some paid with their lives, ditching in the ocean when their tanks ran dry. Others made it back with nothing to spare, but the commitment was total, and the results justify the cost. This total commitment was, in microcosm, the American approach to the war. The industrial mobilization that followed Pearl Harbor was not half-hearted or provisional. It was absolute. Factories retooled, shipyards expanded, training programs accelerated. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rationing, war bonds, draft calls, the entire society reoriented toward victory. The same willingness to commit everything that McClusky showed in his fuel-burning search was reflected at the national level, and just as his gamble paid off, so too did the nation's. The Japanese understanding of Midway, documented in post-battle analyses and interrogations of captured officers, reflected shock and confusion. The loss of 4 carriers in a single day was incomprehensible. Japanese planning had assumed American forces would be cautious, defensive, reactive. Instead, they had been aggressive, willing to take enormous risks, and ruthlessly effective. The psychological impact was profound. The myth of Japanese invincibility shattered. Operational planning shifted from offense to defense. Resource allocation prioritized defending what had been gained rather than expanding further. The war's momentum reversed. But more than tactics or strategy, Midway shook Japanese confidence in their own assumptions. They had believed that spirit, the intangible quality of fighting will and moral superiority, would overcome material disadvantage. They had believed their pilots, disciplined and experienced, could defeat American pilots who lacked both qualities. They had believed their carriers, proven in battle after battle, were unbeatable. Midway disproved all of it. American pilots, many on their first mission, had found and destroyed the elite of Japanese naval aviation. American carriers, supposedly inferior, had survived and prevailed. An American spirit, the improvisation, the adaptability, The refusal to quit had proven at least equal to Japanese discipline. This was not the lesson Japanese leadership wanted to learn. Admitting that the enemy possessed comparable or superior will was ideologically unacceptable, so the defeat was rationalized. Bad luck, poor coordination, intelligence failures. The narrative constructed after Midway avoided the deeper truth that the Americans had outfought them not through superior equipment or numbers, but through better decision-making under pressure. The aftermath of Midway rippled across the Pacific. War, Japanese carrier construction accelerated, but replacing trained pilots proved far more difficult than replacing ships. American pilot training programs expanded, producing competent aviators in numbers that overwhelmed Japanese capacity to counter them. By 1943, American carrier groups operated with impunity, launching strikes against targets that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. By 1944, the disparity was so vast that Japanese carriers, when they sortied, were little more than targets. The strategic initiative passed permanently to the United States. Island-hopping campaigns rolled across the Central Pacific. The Philippines were retaken. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle brought American forces closer to Japan itself, and at every stage, the carrier groups that had triumphed at Midway reinforced and expanded, provided the air power that made amphibious assaults possible. But the men who flew those missions carried with them the memory of June 4, 1942, the day when everything hung on fuel and luck and the willingness of one man to keep searching. When logic said to turn back, that memory shaped doctrine. It reinforced the importance of initiative. It taught that battles were won not by following plans, but by adapting when plans failed. Enterprise herself survived the war, accumulating more battle stars than any other American carrier. She participated in nearly every major engagement in the Pacific, her aircraft striking targets from Guadalcanal to Tokyo. When she was finally decommissioned in 1947, she carried with her the ghosts of the pilots who had flown from her deck into the chaos above Midway and, against all odds, prevailed. The film Midway, in both its versions, attempted to capture this legacy. The 1976 version, released during the American bicentennial, emphasized heroism and sacrifice, reflecting a national need to remember the war as a time of unity and purpose. The 2019 version, released in an era more skeptical of such narratives, focused on the brutality and chaos, showing the war as it was rather than as it was remembered. Both struggled with the same fundamental challenge: how to make improvisation cinematic. Film demands structure, but the battle's actual structure was improvised in real time by men who had no script and no assurance of a happy ending. The most underrated aspect of the film and of the battle was not the action, spectacular though. It was the quiet moments. McClusky staring at empty ocean, deciding to keep going. Pilots in the ready room, waiting for orders that would send them into the unknown. Mechanics on the flight deck, hands bleeding from rushed work, launching aircraft they knew might not return. These moments lacked drama in the conventional sense. There were no explosions, no heroic speeches, just decisions made, work done, risks accepted. But these were the moments that mattered. The spectacle of the dive bombers plunging through flak, the carriers burning, the desperate scramble to get home was the consequence of those quiet decisions. Film naturally gravitates towards spectacle. It is visual, visceral, immediate, but the battle was won in the quiet moments, and the film's failure to fully convey that was not a flaw of execution, but a limitation of the medium. Decades after the war, veterans of Midway gathered for reunions, their numbers dwindling each year. They spoke little of heroism. Mostly, they remembered the fear, the uncertainty, the friends who did not come back. They remembered fuel gauges and empty skies and the overwhelming relief of seeing the carrier deck appear through the haze. They remembered not the victory, but the survival, and they remembered McClusky's decision. The decision that was not in the plan, not in the doctrine, but was exactly right for that moment. The decision that trusted instinct over procedure, commitment over caution. The decision that defined not just the battle, but the character of the men who fought it. That character pragmatic, adaptable, willing to take risks, but not reckless. Trusting individual judgment, but working toward collective goals was distinctly American. It was not superior in some abstract sense. Other nations produced brave men, skilled pilots, effective tactics. But the combination of initiative and teamwork, improvisation and discipline, Individual judgment and institutional trust, that combination proved decisive at Midway. And across the war, the film captured pieces of this. The 2019 version, in particular, showed McClusky's search and his decision to extend it, emphasizing the fuel gamble. But even that portrayal could not fully convey the weight of the decision. Film compresses time. What feels like minutes on screen was an eternity in the cockpit. The audience knows the outcome. The pilots did not. They flew into uncertainty, committed everything, and hoped it would be enough. It was. The legacy of Midway extended beyond tactics and strategy into the realm of national myth. The battle became a parable about American resilience, the ability to absorb catastrophic losses and strike back with devastating effect. Pearl Harbor was the tragedy. Midway was the redemption. The narrative fit neatly into broader stories. Americans told themselves about their history stories of underdog victories, of improvisation triumphing over rigid planning, of democratic individualism defeating authoritarian discipline. These stories were not false, but they were incomplete. Midway was not inevitable. It could easily have ended differently. If McClusky had turned back when his fuel ran low, the Japanese carriers would have survived. If the torpedo bombers had not, through sheer accident, drawn Japanese fighters out of position, the dive bombers would have faced concentrated opposition. If the bombs had missed, or failed to penetrate, or detonated in less critical locations, the carriers might have survived to strike back. Victory required not just skill and courage, but luck and the willingness to create opportunities for luck to matter, that willingness to commit fully, to take risks, to trust that effort and improvisation could overcome disadvantage was the deeper lesson of Midway. It was a lesson about how democracies fight wars, not through rigid hierarchies that demand obedience, but through flexible systems that trust individuals to make decisions, not through plans that must be followed exactly, but through doctrines that provide frameworks and encourage adaptation, not through the cult of the heroic leader, but through the distributed competence of thousands of individuals, making good decisions under pressure. The film Midway hinted at this lesson, but could not fully articulate it. Film, as a medium, tends toward the personal and the dramatic. It focuses on individuals, McClusky, Nimitz, the pilots and their decisions. It struggles to depict systems, cultures, institutional practices, but the victory at Midway was as much about systems as individuals. It was about intelligence organizations that shared information quickly, training programs that produced competent pilots in large numbers, maintenance crews that kept aircraft flying under brutal conditions, supply chains that delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts to carriers operating thousands of miles from base. All of these systems, invisible in the film, were essential to victory, the symbolic fuel that defined the battle burn searching for the enemy, hoarded for the return. The constant calculation of time and distance became, in retrospect, a metaphor for the entire American war effort, the willingness to spend resources, to commit fully, to gamble everything on achieving the objective. This was not recklessness, it was calculated risk, informed by intelligence and experience, but ultimately requiring a leap of faith that the expenditure would yield results. That faith was rewarded at Midway. It would be tested again in the years that followed at Guadalcanal, at the Philippine Sea, at Light Gulf, but it held. The American military learned from Midway that committing fully, even at great risk, was more effective than cautious half measures. This lesson informed operations across the Pacific and shaped the strategic bombing campaign over Europe. It became, in some sense, the American way of war: overwhelming commitment of resources, acceptance of high costs, confidence that losses could be absorbed and replaced. The Japanese, by contrast, learned the opposite lesson. Midway taught them caution. Carriers became precious resources to be hoarded rather than risked. Pilot training, already lengthy, became even more so, reducing the flow of replacements. Defensive postures replaced offensive aggression. These were rational responses to material inferiority, but they conceded the initiative and ensured that every subsequent engagement would be fought on American terms. The years passed. The veterans aged. The films were made and remade. Historians debated tactics, decisions, what-ifs. But the essential story remained. One carrier group, against overwhelming odds, flew into uncertainty and found the enemy at the moment of maximum vulnerability. The victory was not foreordained. It was earned by men who made hard decisions with incomplete information. and committed everything to the outcome, that commitment total, uncompromising, willing to spend the last drop of fuel. To find the target was the spirit that won Midway. It was the spirit that won the war, and it was the spirit that the film, for all its spectacle and drama, struggled to fully capture, because that spirit was not cinematic. It was quiet, internal, manifested in choices made in cockpits and ready rooms, in the decision to keep searching when logic counseled retreat, in the trust that individual judgment, aggregated across thousands of men, would somehow cohere into victory. The film was underrated not because it failed to depict this spirit though it struggled, but because audiences did not fully grasp how radical and improbable the victory actually was. Midway entered popular memory as a triumph, which it was, but it was a triumph balanced on the edge of disaster, saved by decisions that could easily have gone the other way. Understanding that fragility, that contingency, deepens appreciation for what was achieved. And so the story of Midway endures, not as myth, though it has mythic qualities, not as tragedy, though many died, but as testament to what can be accomplished when individuals, trusted with responsibility and empowered to act, rise to meet the moment. McClusky rose. His pilots rose. The mechanics, the planners, the intelligence officers all rose. Collectively, imperfectly, they achieved something that seemed impossible. The film captured the spectacle. History recorded the facts, but the essence, the quiet decisions, the fuel burning away, the commitment to keep going when every rational calculation said to turn back, that essence lived only in the memories of those who were there. And as those memories faded, as the veterans passed, the lesson risked fading too. But it should not, because the lesson of Midway is timeless. That victory is not assured, that plans fail, that success depends on individuals making good decisions under pressure, that trust, flexibility, and willingness to commit fully matter more than any technological advantage, that democracies, messy and improvisational, can outfight authoritarian systems precisely because they trust individuals rather than demanding obedience. One carrier against the entire Japanese fleet, not literally, but symbolically, Enterprise and her escorts, outnumbered and outgunned, committing everything to a search that burned fuel they might need to survive, finding the enemy, striking with everything they had, and prevailing, not through superiority, but through courage, judgment, and the absolute refusal to accept defeat. That is the story the film told, imperfectly, but powerfully, and that is the story that deserves to be remembered, not as myth, but as truth.